before we get going, I want to thank Don Maycock. He doesn't know I'm going to say this, and I suspect he's watching right now. But Don, thank you so much. Very moving. There was a parcel that arrived. We all assumed it was a letter bomb. Well, it's me, and it is Sun News. But it was a parcel. It was full of little squeaky toys for a dog. And he bought them for his Jack Russell. Very sadly, the poor little thing was ill, had to be put to sleep. But anyway, rather a moving letter. You didn't put a phone number or anything here, so I couldn't contact you directly. But thank you. That was lovely. That was lovely. And Tilly, our Parson Russell Terrier, will be destroying those toys within a couple of hours, I would think. Now, speaking of destroying things, John Chrétien and his supporters. Do you remember that they used to make a lot of noise, and sometimes still do, really, about Chrétien, when he was Prime Minister, his refusal to participate in the Iraq War. Now, you might be surprised, but I happen to agree with this decision. While the war in Afghanistan was entirely justified, Iraq wasn't really, on a moral, military, or political level. It was not a justified war. It was ill-advised. But let's be consistent here. While Washington and London are rather gung-ho about supporting the rebels in Syria and arming the war against President Assad, the Harper government is holding back and has decided not to become involved. So, where are the alleged experts on the Middle East? Where are the peaceniks? Where are the leftists now? Why aren't they cheering on the Tory government and congratulating them? Well, you know why, and you know it'll never happen. But Harper is quite right. It's all too vague, too opaque, too messy in Syria at the moment. It isn't some David and Goliath, good and bad, right and wrong conflict. Bashar al-Assad never wanted or expected to be president. He trained as an optometrist in London, in England. He married a British Syrian woman, intended to settle down as a doctor either in the UK or in Syria. That was really what he wanted. Then his brother died, an accident. His father died, old age, and he was handed the keys to the presidential office. He was reluctant, but his hand was forced. He had no choice, no option. It's important here to ignore the armchair experts, the neoconservative fanatics, the anti-Israel zealots, they all join up, who drown in that very black and white simplicity over all of this. Syria, even more than most Arab states, is very complex, highly nuanced. Assad came to power as a reformer. He did. And he intended to introduce a variety of changes inspired by his time living in Britain. He was told very quickly, though, by the army in particular, "Ooh, that ain't going to happen." He could keep Syria secular, he was told, continue to tolerate Christians and other religious minorities, continue to guarantee women's equality, continue to oppress Islamic fundamentalism, continue to keep the border with Israel, the Golan Heights, very quiet. There's been no conflict there for decades. Believe me, I've been there many times. Nothing at all. But he couldn't, he was told, try to turn Syria into a Western state. He better not. So he compromised. And then Iran was liberated and made more powerful by the war in Iraq. Saddam, please remember this, had acted as a counterbalance to Persian influence, and then Turkey became progressively more politically Islamic and militant, making it impossible for Assad to continue with his overtures to the Turks. I know it's complex, isn't it? It's not what you hear on the other stations, but this is true. And now comes this uprising. And now comes Russia, which has sent in more than a dozen warships with air and marine support. That's pretty good. I would have gone and joined the Russian Navy now. Now, you're going to see an interview with Daniel Pipes in a few moments, and Daniel and I disagree a bit on this, but I'm concerned that is not to be sniffed at. Moscow has few allies anymore and only one major naval base outside of its own waters. I don't think it's going to abandon Syria. So if Obama does arm the rebels, and he says he will, and Moscow continues to arm Assad, we're seeing a vicarious superpower struggle, something we haven't seen in years. The rebels aren't unified, but just like pretty much every other revolution in history, the hardcore fanatics, they always dominate in the end. The regicides in England in 1649, the Stalinists in Spain during the Civil War, Bolsheviks in Russia in 1917, they were just a minority, and so on. I mean, do you seriously believe that progressive socialists and progressive liberals will triumph over Al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood? Really, you believe that? Assad is a dictator, and he can be a brute, certainly. But he's not a fundamentalist, and he doesn't want a fundamentalist state. He doesn't want to destroy Israel. He doesn't want to create a caliphate and sponsor international terrorism. That is not what he's trying to do. Hezbollah has way too much freedom in his country, but that's due to Iranian power more than the will of Damascus. I'm not an isolationist. Really, I think there's a time to intervene, but this is simply not Canada's fight. We have other things to spend our money on, other causes, good ones to back, and other people to support. Allow the Americans and the British to play games in the Middle East if they want to, and let Ottawa continue to flourish as a middle power. I've said this before, but the best, most informed voice on the Middle East, certainly in the English-speaking world, is Daniel Pipes, Middle East Forum. Of course, he joins us now from Los Angeles. And thank you for doing so, Daniel. I know how much in demand you are. Let's begin with Syria, then we'll go on to Turkey, and these things are so entwined. In Syria, what I do worry about is this vicarious war being fought by, not so much by the United States, they don't want foot soldiers on the ground, but the Russians. It's a pride issue with Russia. They still believe they are an empire. This is one of the few areas they have left in the world outside of Russia where they have an ally and a naval base. They're surely not going to abandon Syria.
No, I don't think they will abandon Syria, but at the same time, the stakes are not that high for the Russians, and I don't think they'll really go much further. The really key thing right now is the S-300s. This is an air defense system that they may or may not be providing to the Syrians, and the Israelis have made it clear that they will not accept such provision, and they've alluded, they've hinted, suggested that they will attack these S-300s before they're deployed, and that could mean attacking Russian personnel. So that's something to worry about. I just don't see that the Russians want this kind of conflict. This is not the Soviet Union. They're meddling, they're making trouble, but I don't think they want a hot war with Israel or anyone else.
That is fascinating, though, because the Israeli-Moscow relationship obviously has been transformed since the Soviet Union. I don't think Putin, on a personal level, is particularly opposed to Israel, but Russia does have its allies in the Arab world, and Netanyahu made some comments recently that didn't exactly please Moscow. The idea, though, of Israel directly attacking Russian-supplied arms, perhaps with Russian personnel operating them, surely that is pretty serious.
That is indeed serious. But you alluded to Russian allies in the Arab world, but those allies are fading away because there is great hostility towards the Syrian government throughout the Arabic-speaking countries now. Yeah. So the Russians have weakened their own position. It's the Russians with the Iranians and the Syrians. It's not exactly a winning hand in the Middle East. You wonder how far they're going to go with this. I'm less concerned than you. Yes, I am worried about a Russian, I almost said Soviet, Russian Israeli confrontation, but I don't think it's going to come about, and I don't think the Russians are that invested here that they will go so far as to prompt a crisis.
All right. In former times, clash of empires, Ottoman and Russian. Let's talk about Turkey now, because the demonstrations, the rioting hasn't really stopped, and it's not just one or two cities, it's many cities, and it's a strange alliance now, quite a surprising one, of various secularists or people who simply oppose the regime of right and left. But here is a prime minister that does have massive support still. But let's talk a little bit about his rivals, the president, for example. There are other politicians in Turkey who would happily step into his place if he vacated.
There's no rival.
Really?
No. He strides in Turkey without rival. The analogy I like to use is that of Margaret Thatcher. She dominated Britain for the 1980s, and there was no rival. But at a certain point, her party had enough of her, and they got rid of her as prime minister. And I think that's possible here. There was a 7-hour meeting yesterday by Erdogan's party, the AKP, 7 hours. And I imagine, I have no idea what happened, but my imagination takes me to the notion that his colleagues unanimously said, hey, Tayyip, cool down. This isn't working. Don't be so provocative. Don't be so hardline. Stop calling them looters and bums, and stop talking them beer guzzling people with shoes on going into mosques, and stop provoking. And if he doesn't, I could imagine that they would say, thank you, you've done a great work for a decade, time for someone else with a milder approach. Now, should that happen, then the consequences of this whole uprising will not be very great. It will be the removal of this highly accomplished and very provocative leader, and someone else will follow him who will pursue the same policies but in a less provocative way, in which case we who are concerned about the Islamism that's rising in Turkey will find no major difference, just a different implementer. However, should these protests continue because Erdogan is so provocative, and should the lenders of money to Turkey, who are crucial in keeping the Turkish economy going, pull their money out, which they could very quickly, then I think things will be very different, and there will be a general turn against not just Erdogan himself, but the AKP, his party, and then we could see a real turn in Turkey away from Islamism. So I think the economy, and more exactly the creditors, are the key people in this drama.
But outside of his party, when I think of the opposition parties, the last couple of years, none of them seem to be particularly well organized or serious.
They're not organized, they're not serious. I mean, they're organized. There are three parties in parliament. None of them are very impressive, and nobody's emerged, and there are no real arguments. Yeah. So any analysis of the future of Turkey has to do with splits among the AKP and the AKP supporters. For example, between the president, Gül, and Erdogan, between someone called Gülen, who is a very powerful figure outside of government, and so forth. That's where all the thinking goes. No one looks to the other party for any kind of possible challenge to the ruling party.
Yeah. Well, the president, I mean, when I mentioned rivals, it seems to me at least that he has tried to establish himself as an alternative at least. He has said we should listen to the demonstrators. They're not just looters and thugs. They may have something to say. This is democratic. But that's a challenge, isn't it?
You're talking about the president, Abdullah Gül. Well, he and Erdogan founded the party together, are long-term allies. And yes, there are tensions between them, as Gül takes a more accommodating approach in this case, as in many others before it. And so he is becoming more popular than Erdogan, and he is the softer face. However, from my point of view, Gül is not better than Erdogan. In fact, in some ways he's worse, because he'll implement this Islamist project in a less provocative way and more successful way.
Yeah. You mentioned the creditors. Which countries are we talking about?
It's not countries. It's private institutions that are searching. It's what's called hot money, looking for the highest interest rates, swooping in, swooping out. This can happen in an instant. So it's the investors around the world who are looking for high returns, and they're getting them in Turkey. But I think the events of the last 12 days are going to affect that, because there was an assumption by everyone that Turkey is solid. And now that assumption is gone. And so I think interest rates will go up. It's going to be more difficult, for example, to build these mega projects that Erdogan has in mind. I mean, he wants to build the world's largest airport. He wants to build the world's largest mosque, or anyway, the country's largest. He wants to build a second Bosphorus. The Bosphorus goes between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. He wants to, it's been there for millennia, for eons. He wants to build a second one. He himself has called it a crazy project, extremely expensive. I think it may be more difficult now that the interest rates will go up, and everything will be a little more difficult for Erdogan.
I have heard it said that the Turkish economy, that the great growth and success rate, almost miraculous, is not built on solid ground, and what you're saying seems to support that thesis.
Yes, very much. It's credit-driven, and it could. There's lots of expectation, even before the last 12 days, that this is going to crash. Right. The party can't keep on going on and on and on. But it is phenomenal growth. I mean, the income of Turkey has doubled in Erdogan's period. It's been a very impressive gain. And I was in Istanbul half a year ago, and I first lived there 40 years ago. So I have a perspective, and I was astonished by the growth. I've just never seen anything like this outside of China. China has even more impressive growth, but China, Turkey, they're unique.
Daniel, as always, wish we had more time, but we don't. Great pleasure. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Michael. Good to be here.